comparing a quartet figure, Iris Murdoch, with a quartet plus figure, Dorothy Emmet, born 15 years earlier in 1904, and a half generation later figure born in 1929, Bernard Williams, generally regarded as one of the great British moral philosophers of the later 20th century, and who acknowledges a debt to Murdoch and Foote as well. Williams died young and Emmet died old, so the three passed on within 4 years of each other and were thus reacting to some of the same currents of thought in their shared last decades. The presentation is indeed very much a work in progress. Placing these three very different major figures in a common frame or frames proved extremely challenging. With this audience, I'm taking for granted a knowledge of Murdoch and will assume that Emmet is relatively unknown to most of you, so I'll begin with some biographical and intellectual background on her. Emmet went to Oxford in 1923, a few years after women were first admitted. From early on, she showed an independence of mind, sometimes allied to a distinctly intellectually and personally adventurous spirit that she manifested her entire life. In 1926, there was a general strike in England and Wales in support of mine workers. Emmet, as she put it, quote, did not want to go strike breaking, end quote, defying the then standard expectations of Oxford students and university students more generally to do so. She traveled to the Rhondda Valley in Wales, a mining area with many unemployed miners, where she arranged through a WEA program to teach Plato's political philosophy to the miners. In 1928, Emmet successfully applied for a fellowship to the US to study with Alfred North Whitehead, the British metaphysician and formerly logician who was teaching at the Women's College attached to Harvard University. Returning home, Emmet wrote a book on Whitehead's famously difficult metaphysical views. Then 10 years later, she wrote The Nature of Metaphysical Thinking, a defense of metaphysics as a form of analogic thinking against the positivist attack of that period. She had secured a permanent position at the University of Manchester, and mostly on the strength of those two books, attained the rank of professor in 1946, only the second woman philosopher in Britain to do so after Susan Stebbing. But Emmet always saw herself as a moral, social, and political philosopher and philosopher of religion. In the mid-50s, she joined a seminar somewhat interdisciplinary in character, run out of the social anthropology department by Max Gluckman, a South African-born Jewish anthropologist of Africa, anti-colonialist in his political outlook. This seminar deeply influenced Emmet intellectually, and she wrote a book, Function, Purpose, and Powers, Some Concepts in the Study of Individuals and Societies, in 1958, which dealt with theoretical issues in anthropology such as ritual, symbols, and function, reflected on the nature of society and its various sub-processes, and moral matters related to these concerns. Continuing in that interdisciplinary direction, in 1960, she arranged a stay at Columbia University in New York City, in part to consult with Robert Merton, the foremost American sociologist of his generation. Upon her return, Emmet wrote a book, Rules, Roles, and Relations, that developed a social conception of morality in the context of exploring connections between sociology and ethics. She went on to publish occasionally in both anthropology and sociology venues and retained an interdisciplinary orientation in all of her subsequent work in normative philosophy. In 1966, Emmet retired early from Manchester, where she had substantially built its philosophy department, and moved to Cambridge to be a central figure in a religious philosophical community, the Epiphany Philosophers, with an interdisciplinary membership including several future prominent natural scientists, the future Archbishop of Canterbury and Iris Murdoch scholar Rowan Williams, and the Ghanaian British American philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah. For 15 years, Emmet edited the group's journal that aimed to bring science, religion, and philosophy into dialogue with one another. Emmet kept publishing into her 90s, producing 11 books all told, 4 in metaphysics, 5 in moral, social, and political philosophy, and philosophy of religion. Emmet's interest in spirituality and religion was an important source of intellectual and personal kinship with Murdoch, which Emmet acknowledges explicitly, saying she and Murdoch formed a philosophical friendship, possibly in the 1960s, though there's evidence of earlier contact as well, and that they, quote, shared the need to try to articulate some form of transcendent reference for morality in a world where traditional theological ways of putting this may no longer be an option. Both women became interested in both Buddhism and Hinduism, and also Judaism. This rejection of a sharp line between philosophy and spirituality and religion distinguished Emmet and Murdoch strongly from the mainstream of Anglo-American philosophy in the 50s, 60s, and onwards, when philosophy was often taken to be almost definitionally distinct from spirituality and religion. But it's worth noting that 2 extremely prominent moral philosophers of the later 20th century, Charles Taylor and Alasdair MacIntyre, both of whom were religious Catholics, were each strongly influenced by one of the 2, Taylor by Murdoch in a very deep way, and MacIntyre by Emmet, who taught him at Manchester and collaborated with him in a 1970 collection on theoretical issues in the social sciences. In addition, Emmet read Murdoch's novels with Richard Braithwaite, a philosopher and core member of the Epiphany Philosophers community, with whom Emmet shared a home along with his wife, the brilliant linguist and philosopher Margaret Masterman, and both Dorothy and Richard regarded the novels as sources of deep moral insight. Emmet was a pioneer in Murdoch studies, especially in bringing together her fiction and her philosophic work. Emmet dedicated her 1994 book, The Role of the Unrealizable, which discusses Murdoch's notion of love of the good, to Murdoch. Having read a draft of the book, Murdoch expressed great enthusiasm for it in several letters to Emmet. For example, "Your book is terrific. You cover the vast field of philosophy, and you argue in such minute detail and with such wisdom and wit. I love and revere it. You are a real scholar, not like me. I am so proud to have the book dedicated to me." But Emmet's views differed from Murdoch's, and I will argue later Williams as well, on one central and crucial matter. Emmet saw the moral enterprise of life as deeply social in character, and Murdoch did not. Emmet sees sociology and ethics having a, quote, common starting point in the fact that people need to live in social relationships with each other, not only for survival, but if they are to carry out any of the characteristic human enterprises, end quote. For Emmet, human beings are bound up in a common life with one another in organized societies, in particular in their societies' organizations, institutions, and structures. And morality is an integral part of that common life. She cites Aristotle in support of this view. He that could live apart from society might be a beast or a god, but not a human being. Few philosophers in the analytic or other 20th century traditions, including Murdoch, would see moral philosophy and sociology as having a common starting point. Emmet's social view of morality channels a tradition going back to Hegel, who famously criticized Kant for a purely abstract and overly individualist approach to morality, removing it from its grounding in Sittlichkeit, or organized ethical life in society. A tradition then taken up by the British idealists, T.H. Green, Bernard Bosanquet, and F.H. Bradley in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Emmet was influenced in that same direction by Henri Bergson, whom she refers to frequently, who, along with his French contemporary Émile Durkheim, saw morality as fundamentally social in character, though Bradley also allowed for a distinct individual and partly spiritual dimension of morality beyond the social, a linking of the spiritual and the social that Emmet also embraced. This social view of morality has largely disappeared in post-World War II British moral philosophy. Recovering the idealist Hegelian tradition would be essential for reframing a satisfactory history of 20th century British moral philosophy, I suggest. Emmet developed her social approach most fully with respect to the idea of roles, which she appropriates from Merton and puts to a more definitively moral and normative purpose. Roles are positions within society's structures. Within society's structures and institutions which different individuals occupy at different times, and to which responsibilities, obligations, and duties and norms more generally attach. Professional roles, the type to which Emmet gives the most attention, are a distinctly formally structured type of role with norms spelled out in professional codes and professional bodies empowered to enforce them. But she is also concerned with socially recognized but less formally structured roles, such as parent, friend, or citizen, many facets of whose normativity cannot be legally enforced yet are central to their specific character. Role obligations are to be distinguished from general obligations to human beings as such, but they still involve an impersonal element, as they are the same for any occupant of the role. McIntyre, at the time teaching in a sociology department, highlights the significance of roles to morality in a review of rules, roles, and relations. Quote, the question of how far morality can be conceived of in isolation from a role structure is just the type of question which ought to be put to contemporary moral philosophy, end quote. Implicitly distinguishing a core significance of roles to morality in general from the later development of subdisciplinary versions of it in medical ethics, business ethics, and so on. Emmet was aware that the social conception of morality is sometimes associated with social and political conservatism, affirming existing and traditional social norms and structures, also reflected in the idea of the social as the conventional. She explicitly rejects this view, emphasizing that social structures change over time, and specifically that roles do so in response both to larger socio-historical changes and to individual occupants of those roles pushing against their boundaries. She does not assume that our social roles and institutions are in good order as is, and emphasizes that roles are always open to moral criticism. Emmet does not always make the specific content of social morality clear. Sometimes, though not quite Hobbesian, it's still fairly minimal, a kind of social baseline. Other times it's more expansive. Sometimes she emphasizes the creative aspects of ordinary people with regard to their morality and attributes a failure to recognize this to elitism. I thought that was an interesting use as a term of criticism in 1979. Overall, roles, quote, go deep into our everyday moral lives in society. And though she does not emphasize this point, performing one's role well is a challenge of the moral life. She also implies, though never quite says, that people's roles are generally crucial to the personal meaning their lives have for them. Emmet connects the social aspect of morality with the growth of large organizations in modern societies, an insight she attributes initially to Bradley in his famous, and as she puts it, exasperating as well as trenchant essay, My Station and Its Duties. But she says that philosophical moralists working within an I-thou framework have overlooked this important feature of modern life. In Rules, Roles, and Relations, she devotes an entire fascinating chapter to social and role morality issues connected with large organizations. The recent emphasis in political philosophy on social structures to help understand racism and sexism can draw from Emmet's work, which very much theorizes structures. but her notion of social includes social and personal meaningfulness that the bare notion of structure does not capture, though it does not exclude. In relation to her social view of morality, Emmet says, we are not just unique individuals confronting each other as unique individuals. This statement applies to Murdoch, for whom the unique individual is central to her conception of ethics, using the newer term moral patient for the target or object of moral response. Murdoch almost never portrays either the moral agent or the moral patient as embedded within concrete roles and role relationships inside social institutions, organizations, structures, and practices. Notice that Emmet says we are not just unique individuals, implying that the social perspective she's invoking is not meant to replace an individual one, but to complement it. She gives some attention to their interaction in a discussion and praise of John McMurray, a Scottish philosopher whom she studied with at Oxford and who was influential in the UK in the 1930s and beyond, for recognizing the distinction between the impersonal and the personal dimensions of moral life. I'm afraid I omitted John McMurray from my otherwise quite comprehensive bibliography, even slightly overwhelming, that you have at the end of your handout. One might think the utilitarianism of, say, Mill, Sidgwick, and later R.M. Hare is a social morality in Emmet's sense, as it requires the individual agent to consider the interests of everyone in society, and indeed in the world, when deciding to act. But for utilitarianism, the moral patients whose well-being forms the content of moral prescription are simply human beings as such, not specifically members of the agent's particular society, bound up in the rich tapestry of relationships and roles in which the moral agent is embedded in modern societies, in Emmet's contrast mentioned earlier. But this is not to deny that the term social is indeed sometimes used for a morality that promotes the welfare of other people or human beings as such, as the terminology of pro-social, standardly used by social psychologists in this context, expresses. Indeed, Murdoch's view in Sovereignty of Good is one form of the social in this other person sense. For her, the challenge of a moral life is to grasp and respond to the reality of another particular individual human being as such, though not in the collective and aggregative way utilitarianism does. The other person notion of social is one not deeply or conceptually connected to society, especially when used for a distinct society among others, and is this notion of social referring to people living together and morality's role in the institutions, organizations, and practices involved in that Emmet embraces but is largely absent in Murdoch. There are indeed several distinct historical meanings of society and social. It's extremely complicated terminology, both of those, and they're beautifully laid out by Raymond Williams in his book Keywords. For example, society as personal company, as association, as high society. There's also social as emphasizing the social context. Emmet's meaning differs from all of these, not totally, but largely, and is memorably captured in Margaret Thatcher's rejection of it when she said, quote, "There is no such thing as society, only individual men and women and their families." There are two distinct but related ways that Murdoch and the British moral philosophical tradition more generally, the idealists accepted, is individualistic and not social. One is conceiving of morality or the moral enterprise as lying most fundamentally in the individual moral agents confronting moral reality and working out how to act in light of it. Murdoch has a significantly broader conception of moral agency involved than the standard act-centric view of this tradition. For example, she includes inner thought as part of agency, but she retains the centrality of the individual agent. A second is the conception of the moral agent as bare or unencumbered, and Michael Sandel's influential terminology. sorry, that is Sandel's view, the unencumbered self is roughly one in which no group of which the agent is a part is core to her identity. For Emmet, when acting from a role, one acts not only as a bare individual. One's action makes moral sense only in a context in which other agents are engaged in complementary and coordinated actions in their roles and statuses in the institutions, organizations, and practices the agent shares with them. Morality is something we do together, not only something the individual does. On Emmet's social conception, the relationships and relatedness itself is the fundamental condition of moral agency in the human world. The social view of morality also has implications for how we conceive of the field of moral philosophy itself. It blurs the boundary between moral philosophy and social and political philosophy, and Emmet's work very much exemplifies that blurring, much enhanced in her case by her engagement with sociology and anthropology. Indeed, the traditional conception of moral philosophy might almost be defined as, quote, the individual agency perspective on the moral domain of life. And that characterization pretty much fits both Murdoch and Williams. MacIntyre, Emmetian that he was, in a quirky but fascinating review of metaphysics as a guide to morals, criticized Murdoch for failing to recognize, as he saw it, that her moral ideals required collective agency and community to realize in practice. Emmet's view is a forerunner of and resource for a central strand in contemporary feminist ethics, which emphasizes a relational view of the self. Confucian ethics is yet another ethical tradition currently often being framed as a relational ethic, with links sometimes made to feminism in this regard. Let me now turn to Williams. His work is very wide-ranging, and as with Emmet and Murdoch, there are many aspects I can't engage here. I will focus mainly on a widely discussed line of thought concerning moral agency in two of his earlier works, but which also resonates with his ethical thought more generally, including his most sustained contribution to moral philosophy in the 1985 Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy. Examples of those resonances, which I will enumerate but not be able to discuss, are one, an emphasis on the first personal nature of ethical thinking, two, on individual decision and action as the goal of ethical reflection, three, a rejection of ethical theory, especially in its form of providing a tidy philosophic structure for moral decisions, four, an embrace of a plurality of considerations that go into practical reason, and related to this, five, an account of how non-moral and moral motivations relate to each other. Six, a rejection of any attempt to find a single principle that will govern the entire moral or ethical domain. And seven, doubts that reason and rationality have much of a role in securing the authority of morals or ethics. I should probably acknowledge at the outset how absolutely formative Williams' work was to my own thinking as an aspiring moral philosopher, and also that on a personal level, he helped me get my first book, Friendship, Altruism, and Morality, which was deeply influenced by his early essay, Morality and the Emotions, published in 1980. But then I should also say that Murdoch's Sovereignty of Good was an equally formative and philosophic vision and expanding text for me, which my friend Vic Seidler and I read together in the summer of 1971, our minds blown in the lingo of those times. The moral agency line of thought appears in Williams' critique of utilitarianism from his 1973 essay of that name, paired in a volume, here it is, paired in a volume with J.J.C. Smart's robust defense of act utilitarianism. Williams does not focus on Smart's specific argument, but directs his critique primarily to act utilitarianism as the purest form of utilitarianism in contrast to indirect forms such as motive, disposition, or rule utilitarianism, and to its more abstract its more abstract modality, consequentialism, using Anscombe's terminology there. Williams criticizes utilitarianism from many angles, but I'm interested in his argument that act utilitarianism makes unreasonable moral demands on the individual agent and involves an incoherent view of human agency itself. In her entry on Williams in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Sophie Grace Chappell says that this critique is one of the most powerful of Williams' contributions to philosophy, and I can remember its incredible impact at the time of publication, taking the critique of utilitarianism to a different and deeper level than it had been subjected previously in the lively utilitarianism debates of the 60s and early 70s, becoming, as the Guardian obituary writer said, the subject of innumerable PhDs. According to consequentialism, the criterion for moral action is the maximization of the balance of good over bad outcomes. So, Williams points out, all that counts for the individual agent aiming to act rightly is their place in a causal field, a set of causal levers that can bring about or prevent these outcomes. Whether the outcome be routed through the actions of others or brought about directly by the agent herself is of no moral significance. So, as in one of two now famous examples that Williams employs in this essay, there is no morally significant difference between an agent, whom I will refer to generically as Jane from here on, between Jane taking a job with a firm that produces chemical and biological weapons and her refusing to take that job, but with the foreseeable result that the firm hires another person who will do the same work and cause the same harm. Jane brings about an equally bad outcome in both cases, according to utilitarianism. In utilitarian logic, ordinary agents are presumed to have projects and commitments that give meaning to their lives, and the task of the utilitarian agent is to foster their pursuit of these projects and commitments so as to bring about greatest overall good, taking both the number of and the degree of benefit to those agents into account. Jane is permitted by utilitarianism to promote her own projects and commitments too, but only insofar as the total benefit to all who can be affected by her action happens to make room for it, which it often would not. For example, if by going to work for Oxfam, Jane could support many more people's life projects, but often at the expense of her own. But for Williams, our relationship to our own projects and commitments, especially those fundamental to our very identities as the persons we are, is what constitutes our agency. And he thinks it is therefore not reasonable to demand that we jettison that relationship whenever our location in the potential causal chains to others' welfare would enable us to bring about greater overall benefit. Williams puts this point another way, too, saying, quote, unless there were first-order projects, the utilitarian project would have nothing to work on and would be vacuous. Yet the utilitarian agent is essentially denied those first-order projects because the commitments involved in them would be constantly threatened and undermined by the greater priority to the larger number of people able to be benefited if the agent changed course. The utilitarian agent is permitted only the meta project of maximizing the totality of other people, including herself's first-order projects, an internal tension and perhaps contradiction within the utilitarian outlook. Williams also suggests, as in the quote just mentioned, that the utilitarian conception of human agency is not actually coherent, that agency itself requires having personal projects and commitments. So the utilitarian goal that I just called a meta project could not form an actual project for an actual agent. This powerful critique of utilitarianism and consequentialism more generally garnered a vast secondary literature. But I want now to focus on Williams' view of the character of human agency at the heart of his critique and how it relates to morality. He sees agency as constituted by projects and commitments that provide meaning to the agent's life. This agency as personal meaningfulness project is then counterposed to the impersonal demands of a moral system that requires the agent to maximize overall good outcomes. And Williams is concerned to protect the agent with her agency from that demand. I want to suggest that this view of agency misrepresents the way agency relates to morality, the way morality makes claims on the course of our lives, and the way individual agency does and doesn't require protection from morality. It does so because it misses the social and relational features of agency that Emmet highlights. For Emmet, the role relationships in which the agent is embedded, parent, spouse, nurse, shopkeeper, citizen, neighbor, fellow member of a political organization, have a moral dimension, carrying responsibilities and obligations that are built into the personal meaning those relationships have for the agent. And carrying out projects drawing on those relationships, the agent does so not solely from their personal meaningfulness, but also in recognition and acknowledgement of these moral claims, the honoring of which are essential for the projects to be able to have the meaningfulness that they do have. These claims indeed sometimes express themselves as constraints on something the agent wants to do. She'd like to go to a concert, but her friend needs her at the moment. But the moral demand is internal to and required by a relationship she values and embraces. So these aspects of morality, pervasive in the social and relational world that constitutes our lives, do not take the form of a demand external to anything constituting the meaning of Jane's life, such as that we promote the welfare of human beings as such. Those webs of relationship and the projects and commitments connected with them constitute Jane's agency. They are not merely a context for exercising a pre-given, purely individualistic agency, as they are often portrayed in philosophic discussion of so-named special obligations. Williams indeed acknowledges that there can be morally based projects, but the moral demands therein are incidental to the feature he is concerned with, the projects as meaning conferring. It is that feature that provides Williams' basis for his concern to protect against agentic projects from what he takes to be an inappropriate claim from an impartialist conception of morality. For that concern, it does not matter whether the project itself is driven in whole or in part by moral concerns, and indeed Williams recognizes this. But Emmet's point is that Jane's sense of herself as the agent she is already embodies fundamental moral demands inherent in her network of relationships, and thus the projects connected with them. These moral concerns do not enter only when Jane chooses to embrace or invest in particular optional moral projects, such as joining a social justice organization. This Emmetian line of thought is not intended to, nor does it, challenge Williams' rejection of utilitarianism. Although Emmet's view builds moral concerns into agency in a more robust and intrinsic way than Williams', those moral concerns arise only from and within particular relationships, teacher-student, parent-child, friend-friend. But utilitarianism does not provide for particular human relationships such as these to have independent moral standing. It is essentially a human being to human being moral outlook in Emmet's terminology. Thus, Emmet's conception of agency and morality is no more compatible with utilitarianism than is Williams' project-based conception of agency, but it better captures the variety of moral considerations, some arising from specific relations, others from more universal principles, than does Williams' view in this article. I'm moving into a second article now from 1976, Person's Character and Morality, a kind of companion piece to Critique of Utilitarianism. Williams highlights the importance of personal relationships here in service of a criticism of Kant's ethics as, along with utilitarianism, a form of impartial morality. but in this article, he's regarding Kantianism as the purer form of it. It is important to remember that, at least into the mid-70s, Kantian deontology and utilitarian consequentialism were seen as the main options on offer among ethical theories. The debates were about which of them was superior to the other. Williams, recognizing a deep commonality between deontology and utilitarianism and criticizing them together, was a game changer, analogous to what Murdoch had done earlier with Sartrean existentialism and Hare's prescriptivism, views that had seemed miles apart until she saw their commonalities. In Person's Character and Morality, Williams' criticism is directed at impartial moralities asserting authority over every domain of life, and in particular that of close personal relations. Williams gives an example of a man in a shipwreck choosing between rescuing his wife or a stranger. Williams says demanding that the man justify his choosing his wife by appeal to a moral principle is moral overreach. The man's mind should contain only the thought, "It's my wife." Any further thought is, in Williams' memorable phrase, "one thought too many." That phrase and his larger argument generated extraordinary scholarly attention. The article was anthologized at least as late as 1998 in the canon-defining Oxford Readings in Philosophy Ethical Theory volume, and in a 2015 collection on Williams has a piece by Susan Wolf, a prominent American moral philosopher, with the title "One Thought Too Many." Some situations lie beyond justification, he says. Impartial morality does not properly govern deep personal relationships. But as we just saw, Emmet provides a different take on personal relationships, their relation to moral demands, and the nature of morality itself. For Emmet, the relationship in question comprises and intertwines the man's love and concern for his wife and the importance of their relation in the larger meaning system of his life. Features that Williams is drawing on for this argument. But in addition, and along with the man's moral responsibilities towards his wife that go with marriage, a feature Williams overlooks. That sense of responsibility would normally be taken for granted in his love and concern for her, not experienced as the sort of alien external imposition that Williams is construing morality as impartialist morality to be. Perhaps the only explicit thought that comes into the man's mind is indeed, "She's my wife," but that thought normally tacitly incorporates his sense of responsibility towards her. On Emmet's view, particular moral responsibilities within a personal relationship bound up with personal meaning and love can compete with other more impersonal human being to human being types of morality, represented in this case by the drowning stranger, as they can also compete with self-interested desire. Morality is internal to many forms of social and personal relationship, and their value in human life is thus not wholly non-moral in character, as Williams implies. Marital relationships are not a morality-free zone. So impartial morality in both its utilitarian and Kantian forms, which Williams counterposes to coherent moral agency in the critique of utilitarianism argument, and to personal relationships in the person's character and morality argument, fails to capture and express moral aspects of life highlighted in Emmet's relational conception. Both modalities are plausibly thought of as forms of or aspects of morality. But notice that the impartialist conception also fails to capture Murdoch's view of morality. Murdoch's view is not impartialist, impersonalist, or principle-based. She calls for the individual moral agent to respond with just and loving attention to individual other persons she encounters or is connected to her in her world. The attention is not mediated either by a universal principle, such as concern for each human being or a stance of impartiality toward all, but as a direct particularistic response to an individual person. So neither Emmet's nor Murdoch's conceptions of morality are captured by the impartialist form of morality operating in Williams' argument. His arguments that personal projects and personal relationships lie outside of and can be in tension with impartial morality are acceptable as far as they go, but they distort the character of morality itself and of personal relationships. Just as I argued earlier, they distort the character of agency in relation to morality. One can say then that one thing our three philosophers share is a moral outlook distinctly different from either utilitarianism or Kantianism, along with their considerable differences among themselves. But in Ethics and the Limits, Williams suggests, though without really developing it, that any taking account of the good of other persons in deciding what act to perform, which Emmet's, Murdoch's, and impartialist views all do involve, should be regarded as ethical, a more general category of which impartial morality is therefore only one form or aspect. But this semantic move blocks us from recognizing that both Emmet's and Murdoch's views are indeed views of morality. That is, they present either competing or complementary views of the moral domain or the moral point of view to that of impartialist morality. They are competing if impartiality is taken to define the moral point of view itself. For then both Murdoch's particularistic take on the individual other person and Emmet's relational take on human interaction are forms of moral encounter and response not reflective of impartiality, thus demonstrating that impartiality does not define morality. And they are complementary if impartiality is recognized to be merely one among other moral modalities, each of which is sometimes proper to take up, in which case particularistic loving attention and relationality are other such moral modalities in the very complex and multi-stranded moral domain of life overall. The complexity is masked if morality is taken at the outset to consist only in its impartialist form. Essentially, as a sidebar here, for those of you familiar with Williams' idea of what he calls the morality system, which I can't explain in Ethics and the Limits, I suggest that Williams confusingly employs the term moral in three different ways in that book, and in his ethical writings more generally, but without recognizing this. One, the distortions that he takes the morality system to consist in: denial of moral luck, inflation of the notion of obligation, inflation of the significance of blame. Two, a broader, essentially Kantian and impartialist notion of morality that contains those distortions but has other non-distortive aspects also. And three, but he also uses the term morality in an ordinary language sense, not connected to his official view of it in the morality system discussion, in which it carries whatever manifold associations it does in common usage, including much philosophic usage, but he doesn't notice that he's doing so. His confused usage leaves him unable to recognize that views such as either Murdoch's or Emmet's have historical and conceptual connections to impartialist morality, to Kantianism and utilitarianism as other forms or aspects of morality. I would add that while the terms moral and ethical indeed partly overlap in meaning, they also have some importantly differing associations. When Murdoch says in Sovereignty that philosophers should attempt to answer the questions, how can we make ourselves morally better, and can we make ourselves morally better, these would not in ordinary discourse be taken as equivalent to how can we make ourselves ethically better, etc. Morally good person is not totally equivalent to ethically good person in ordinary speech. And the virtues plausibly associated with Murdoch's moral outlook, loving attentiveness, compassion, care, thoughtfulness, are more naturally thought of as moral than ethical virtues. But none of this damages my Emmetian criticism, lodged at both Murdoch and Williams, that neither adequately recognizes the social dimension of the moral life. Williams, especially with regard to the social dimension of moral agency, and Murdoch with regard to the social dimension of moral relationships and encounter. Had I more time, I would also want to talk about how Emmet wants to leave room for something like Murdoch's centering of the human personal encounter within her overall social framework, and that Williams, very much in line with the British tradition more generally, does not center the human encounter in that way. This point isn't meant as a criticism of Williams, just an observation. But at the same time, Murdoch's sense of that encounter involves a dimension absent in Emmet and in Williams more generally, and indeed in pretty much the entire British tradition, which is the difficulty of seeing the encountered other clearly as demanded by morality because of the many psychic obstacles to the required loving attention, to seeing the other as real as oneself, and fully taking in her difference from oneself, as well as the general opaqueness of human beings to one another. Only Murdoch is really onto that profound challenge, not only to an encounter-based morality, but to any view that places doing good for others as a central ethical task. Okay, so that's kind of the end of the talk, but I think I have a couple of minutes. I just wanted to do kind of two loose ends, if I can. One is about Emmet and Emmet's social perspective does not exclude a concern with individuals. She constantly emphasizes how the social and institutional approach to moral life must take account of the individual who occupies roles and statuses within institutions and organizations and in society more generally. Victor Turner, a distinguished British anthropologist who, as a graduate student, had been a member of Gluckman's Manchester seminar, emphasized this as a distinctive feature of Emmet's take on sociology and anthropology in a preface to the 1972 reissue of Function, Purpose, and Powers. Quote, Emmet always felt that anthropology was not just the study of social institutions, but of institutional man, he says. And note her subtitle to that work, Some Concepts in the Study of Individuals and Societies. Emmet's concern for the individual comes out in various different ways. While praising the idealist Bradley for appreciating how society exists through a network of institutions that provide the foundation for ethical life, she criticizes him for losing a sense of the individual occupant of roles. She provides a very rich, complex, and respectful discussion of Sartre's concerns about individuals using their roles to evade their freedom, though criticizing Sartre's overly individualistic picture of moral decision and choice, and his not recognizing the social dimension of morality. She has an extended discussion of the place of the exceptional individual in historical explanation, while assiduously avoiding a great man theory of history. So these are just some of the ways that the idea of the individual gets her attention. And then finally, this is really just something I have been struggling with. I didn't really write it down exactly, but I've been troubled by Williams has kind of a negative take on Murdoch. He reviews Fire in the Sun fairly negatively, and he doesn't pay attention to her philosophy. But there's an aspect of his thoughts that really should have welcomed his doing that, which is that he has this idea of ethical theory, which I just kind of alluded to, and when he thinks about ethical theory, I don't know if it's always like totally exactly the same, but it's often thought of as just like this philosophical structure that helps people decide what to do, the way Kantianism and utilitarianism do. And he contrasts ethical theory with another kind of philosophic ethics. I think he uses that term, I'm not sure. A kind of philosophical ethics that would start with moral experience, and I think he sometimes calls it moral phenomenology, And it seems to me that's what Murdoch does. She doesn't, she is a philosophic moralist. She thinks philosophically about morality, but she doesn't try to offer an ethical theory in that sense at all. And so she does this thing that he says is, as it were, the right alternative to ethical theory, but he very seldom engages in that enterprise himself. So I'm critical of him for not honoring Murdoch properly. I'll stop there.